Thanks, London. Morning, everybody. So 15 minutes is short, so we need to keep it relevant, and I hope you can take something away today on this topic. So preventing Steinhoff, the topic at hand is obviously your fraud risk management, but if one has a look at risk, fraud risk is just an aspect of business risk. Business risk can be various type of risks from your strategic, operational, etc. So your fraud risk is a part of business risk that needs to be managed. So how big a risk is it? Just a few stats on it. The PwC Economic Crime Survey for 2018 says 77% of entities being affected by economic crime in the country. And if you look at how much it costs you, if you go to the fraud examiners, they say, well, we talk about 5% of revenue. Just stop for a moment on 5% of revenue. If your profit is 10% of revenue, 5% of revenue means that you can lose half of your profit if you work on those type of estimates. And then the other problem with economic crime is how much of it is actually detected if you want to quantify it. So if it's detected, you can investigate it, and if you look at the police stats, you might also get numbers, but how much of that is successfully going through the courts? So we don't really know the extent of it. So it forms part of risk and specifically your fraud risk. How does it get detected? Well, the survey, the PwC survey, goes further and says, well, via fraud risk management, 18% suspicious activity monitoring. In other words, the detection part of it talks about 11%, and then tip-offs and whistleblowing. So when I end off in this 15 minutes your whistleblowing policy, and now what do you do with your Protected Disclosure Act and all the legislation surrounding reporting of these events. So risk, the TARA principle, something you can take away, the TARA. First of all, you can transfer your risk in a business, so that means taking out an insurance policy. You give it to somebody else, as an example. The second is to accept the risk. So you look at the impact and the likelihood. Say, well, I can live with this. I know about the risk, I can live with it. Reduce the risk, that's what I'm trying to do here today. So what can we do to actually reduce the risk? And what you're not supposed to do is to say, well, we're going to avoid the risk. It's impossible. You're not going to avoid the risk of economic crime and fraud happening to your organization. Accept that. So how do we manage fraud risk? First, the prevention side. So it's the world of pre-crime. And I was thinking of a movie this morning, The Minority Report. I don't know if you've seen it. So it's these balls coming out of a thinking tank, and then they will act on a crime that's going to happen. It's perfectly predicted. Well, we don't have that type of technology yet, but you are moving in a world of pre-crime. What can we do to prevent it? The detection part of it is picking it up, investigating it. Unfortunately, at that stage, we are too late when we have detected it. And then it's about how you respond to that, which is also very important in your fraud response plan, for instance. Things happen in your organization, it's detected, what now? In most instances, it gets messed up, the manner in which it's investigated, reporting obligations not being fulfilled. So you should preempt your response when something like that happens. It's all basics, but one forget to think about it and get your thoughts and your policies sorted out to deal with it. So from a prevention side, the identification of fraud risks would be your first step. Let's identify areas prone to fraud, and how do we do that? Well, normally through workshops and or consultations with personnel, getting outside people in to assist with that. But a very nice guidance in dealing with this is what they call the fraud triangle. I don't know if you've come on this piece of information earlier, but it's something the fraud examiners quite often refer to. And it consists out of pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And they say if those three elements are present, you most probably will have your fraud or your economic crime happening. So let's look at the first one, just stand still here for a while. Pressure. So I'm the FD of a company, and my bonus at the end of the year will depend on profit, what we make. Is there immediately some pressure on how we reflect our financials for the year? Yes, it is a pressure. Second thing, do I have the opportunity to influence the figures? I think I do. Then we remain with the third one. What prevents me from doing that? What is the culture within my organization? The tone set at the top. How do I rationalize my own moral behavior? What type of person am I? Am I the gambling type? Do I have lots of racehorses? Do I gamble a lot? Do I have many girlfriends? How do I act within my marriage? All of that, I don't say right, wrong. I just say this is the person you're talking about. So what is the extent of genuineness that we are working with? So if you sit with a Steinhoff, for example, and you go retrospectively, and you start ticking these boxes, it's very clear because history is always an exact science. So the trick is in the world of pre-crime. So I have this lady working with cash. She's a single mum with 4 children. They are now entering high school. They are doing very good at sport, various sport events that needs to be paid. She's working with the cash. We have very poor segregation of duties. We don't have much cross-checking, reconciliations that gets performed. And, you know, when it's about your kids, the rationalization part becomes weaker and weaker. You have it. It's a fraud risk. So how do you respond to that? You employ a person who has been involved in financial irregularities, probably not dismissed from the company, but you still keep him in the finance department. It's a risk. So this triangle can help you to think about your fraud risks. Right. So I just want to show you something practical, not to bore you too much with this. This is something I got from the COSO, Committee for Sponsoring Organizations, and it's some examples of how they deal with these risks. The first one is to identify your fraud risk and your scheme. In this instance, let's say it's theft of inventory. Then you consider the likelihood, how probable, and how severe, the impact. And you note it. Who might be involved? Are there existing fraud controls that will take care of it? How effective is it? And normally your internal audit comes in, testing your controls. And then you say, what is your residual fraud risk once you've gone through that process? And what do you do to mitigate that risk? So it's just something practical eventually if you have a checklist like this. So in Steinhoff's case, most probably, you'll have the misrepresentation of your financials and you will move on. How was that assessed? And what was the cover mechanisms, the safeguards that was in place or not in place in preventing that to happen? So it's just a brief practical example. That brings me to another picture. Yeah. Practical tips taking away today for what are you and your organization going to do about fraud risk management? 5, 6 simple things. First of all, do you have a fraud response plan? The fruit hits the fan, what now? Do you have a plan? Are your policies in place? Do you know who to report it to? Does your personnel know how to report it to and what to do with it? And who are you going to call in to assist you? Some things might be trivial, some things might be much more severe. If you start thinking about reputational damage and the costs pertaining to that, can be very severe. So do you have a plan? If you don't plan, you plan to fail. So do you have your plan? Is it documented? Does your personnel know about it? Then appoint a nominated individual or a champion, a person in your organization that's going to be responsible for dealing with these matters. Primarily to get the response plan out, to see that your policies are there, a go-to person. Normally, one that's also in charge perhaps of your ethics committee or on your ethics, how it's structured in your organization. Who does this person report to? Please, not the MD or the FD. Most probably an audit committee at board level, higher up. That's sometimes also the problem you have with your internal audit, is who does your internal audit report to? To what extent does internal audit get pushed down by your financial director or your MD? So it's about governance. It's the whole topic about corporate governance. But have we identified a champion who's going to deal with fraud risk? Is there a team in the company? And that should form part of your response plan. Who's your team? What legal people are you going to involve? At what stage are you going to call in external help? So all of that plays a part. And then training. To what level are your employees trained and made aware of fraud? Most of us talk about fraud all the time. Do we really know what the definition of fraud is? When is a thing wrong and when is a thing right? So I'm working at my office and I'm printing out some private stuff on the printer. I'm using the internet to do my auto trader and Facebook and whatever for 2 to 3 hours a day. At what stage are we crossing lines? At what stage am I not acting in the best interest of my company? But do we have a policy to say it's not right? Do we properly train people to make them aware of it? Simple stuff that escalates into bigger and bigger problems. When you listen to a seasoned fraudster that gave a lecture a few years ago, he said it's like the frog in the water scenario. It gets warmer, slower and slower, and in the end it's too late. You're in too deep. So it starts off by the small things. But what is the tone that is set from the top? That's the important thing. What is the examples we go through? We can't have our top directors abusing the company to a certain extent and then expect people who work with cash or whatever to be squeaky clean. So are we brave enough to say this is our policy, this is our tolerance levels? We communicate it. We give training to our staff. We make them properly aware that this is serious for us in this company. So then we ask the question, why do companies fail? Why are these corporate scandals there? What did we do in the pre-world? Simple, simple questions. But that will to stand up against it, to enforce good corporate governance, is it there or not? So the training aspect. And then obviously, if you look at whistleblowing, we have legislation relevant to that, the Protected Disclosures Act, and I think Section 159 of the Companies Act also requires this to be enabled. But do we have a policy on that? Do we have a proper prosecution policy? Are we acting against these irregularities and mishaps within an organization? And then I want to conclude to say that irrespective of all our IT, irrespective of all our wonderful networks and software programs, we're still working with people. We are still people on this planet. Are we employing the right people? And how do we vet that we employ the right people? You all will know, once you've appointed somebody, they are there. It's a much more difficult process to leave a firm than to get in there. But shouldn't we make it just as difficult to get into an organization? To what extent do we vet? To what extent do we make sure if there's a 3-month gap in this person's employment history, what happened there? Why don't we go the extra effort and find out? Do the proper due diligence. What we do is all these psychological reports, of course. Does it fit into the culture and all of that? I'm not saying it's less important. But do the vetting of this person. Get the reference. Fill in those gaps. Because if we look at economic society as a whole, we're just passing one person's problem to the next company. And many of the instances where I was involved in investigations, this person had a track history at another company as well. So how did he get to be employed at the next company? So I think summarizing it, if you take away in a 15-minute session something tangible, vet your employees that you employ, have a plan, train the people, sort your policies out. So that is what my idea of a Crammer event was, to tell you some things. Thank you, ladies and gents.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Sure.
We have some very interesting questions, and some of them are basically kind of very much linked. I first want to just touch on the poll, which is kind of leads into the question. So the poll was, does your company have forensic risk processes in place to prevent Steinhoff happening to you? 100% from the crowd says they do. Yes, we have all. Oh, it's actually now changed. It's changing as I'm speaking. Well, it's still the majority, 71% and 25%, which is interesting because probably Steinhoff would have said the same thing before the actual event happened. But I think the theme that's coming from the questions is really the role of the external auditor. I had the pleasure of dealing with, being with the King Commission, King Committee, a couple of days ago, and this theme came up a lot with the auditors, them raising their hand that it's unfair. It's unfair for all the blame to be placed on us.
Yeah, I want to talk about that.
So the first real question, and I think it's really linked, is it the external auditor's responsibility to detect and prevent fraud risk? And linked to that, how much can we rely on our external auditors to detect economic crime?
Very little reliance to start off. The World Economic Forum released yesterday. It's an index of how reliable is our auditing standards. 2 years ago, South Africa was top in the world. We're now in somewhere like 55, 2 years' time. So I can list all the audit scandals for you. The problem is the expectation gap that existed in the market of what an auditor is supposed to do and what an auditor actually does is massive. Remember the clean audit phobia that they were going on municipality by municipality. An auditor tells you these financial statements is a reasonable reflection, not an absolute, of the financial position and the income statement. It doesn't say to you that I've investigated occurrences of fraud and corruption. There is an auditing standard that says if there's fraud and corruption and it affects the financials, you need to do something. You have to look for that. But the auditor tells you there's some credibility to the financial statements. Full stop. That's why they audit. They work on samples. They are subjective, and that's what they're supposed to do. But the perception in the mind of the public was, if I have a clean audit, everything is sound. We are fraud-free. That is the biggest misnomer, and it had proved itself to be a misnomer. So I feel sorry for the external auditors. But they should have managed that expectation gap. Because it's nice in these school uniforms you get these days, the badges go on, up until your shoes. At some stage you need to say, this badge is not my badge. I'm not supposed to do it. Okay, thank you. I can go on.
Yeah. No, look, I think they can go on themselves with their frustration. So we're not going to have time for all the questions, but like I said, the speakers are available during the break. I really encourage you to go to them and speak to them. The last one that I just really want to touch on is what does the prosecution policy entail, and how is the policy different from a disciplinary policy?
Yeah, look, on the legal side of it, I'm not going to be too strong, but I think it's in essence the same. So your disciplinary process is within that, but I think one needs to be more specific. There needs to be more specific examples. Usually when you take somebody to the disciplinary, it's this overarching thing, not acting in the best interest of the company, which it is, but I think one needs to be more specific on the type of things that you express as a stronger view on. More types of wrongdoings that we start listing and coding together with your training. So I don't think it's this massive different thing. I'm talking about more detail.
Great. Okay, thank you, Prof. One of, like I said in the beginning of our discussion, is that we've started a new forensic department at Adams & Adams called Forensic, I think it's Forensic Inc., if I'm not mistaken.
It's a
P2I Limited. So a lot of these and a lot of the services that they provide are really at that pre-crime stage, and I really would encourage you to discuss this with Prof. Prof. He's got a wealth of experience in this area of the field, and it's really fascinating. Discussion which is very topical right now. We're all trying to prevent risk, and we're all trying to prevent Steinhoff from happening to our organizations. I can tell you now from with the lawyers here, we dread that call that we get from our clients at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, saying something like this has happened, risk has happened. So it really is about trying to prevent it at the end of the day.